Okay. Thank you for being here this evening. And my name is Robert SanGeorge. My day job is that I'm the graduate student career advisor for the School of Public Affairs. And as such, I specialize in grad students primarily. And so this evening, we're going to be talking about resumes in particular for grad students. Some of you are seniors, and a lot of the same things apply to what I'm going to be talking about. In fact, just about all of it applies. So let's, oh, and by the way, I've got both the webinar chat and the Q&A open. So ask questions in the chat or the Q&A at any point, and I'm happy to interrupt and answer. What are we going to talk about today? I'm a believer in telling you what we're going to do and then doing it. We'll talk about formatting rules for resumes. We'll talk about how you ought to be thinking about your skill set, why and how a grad student resume in particular might be different. Where should your education section be? That's not the same answer for different people. Relevant coursework. Should you have a relevant coursework section in your resume? Maybe, maybe not. We'll discuss that. Should you have a professional skills profile at or near the top of your resume? I'll explain what that is. I'll show you an example, and we'll also discuss that. The tyranny of reverse chronology. What I mean by that is the rule that says you've got to have your most recent job on top and your second most recent job below that and the third most recent job. There's a way to get around that, and I'll discuss that. What about leadership and activities? Well, first of all, don't call it that. Call it something like campus and community service. But should you have such a section? It depends on what else you have in your resume. And designing resumes for applicant tracking systems. There I'm talking about when you are applying for a job, not an internship, but a job. And the job posting says, click here to apply, and you click and you find yourself within an employer's own system for uploading your resume and uploading a cover letter into their database. And the way that your resume is going to be reviewed and selected or not selected for an interview is very different than what it is when you're sending an employer an email. And we're going to discuss the differences there because it's quite important these days. So let's keep going. All right, formatting. First of all, understand that people are not spending all day looking at your resume. They are going at 100 miles an hour, okay? They're skimming down the left side of the page. That's why we use bullet points in resumes, because it makes it easier for someone to skim down the left side of the page. Generally speaking, only use round black bullet points. That's what employers are used to. As for a font, we strongly recommend trying to use a modern looking font that are known as sans serif, which in French means without serif. And what that means is it just looks better, particularly on a screen. And there are the three best sans serif fonts are Calibri, which you've probably heard of because for a few years it was the default font of Word, and then they ditched it as the default font. Something called Trebuchet, another French word, and another one called Tahoma. Use the same font throughout the resume. Don't start switching the type of fonts you're using. You may think that it makes it look prettier and more interesting. It doesn't. It makes it look more busy and confused. Your font size should be, what kind of font should you use? Between 10 and 12, preferably between 11 and 12, except where your name is at the top of the resume. That could be bigger. That could be size 16 font or size 18 font or something like that. Not much bigger than that. Generally speaking, don't use colors in a resume. It's not going to matter that much. I mean, I've seen people do that. If you're going to use any colors, just use two. And one of them should be black on white. And the other one, maybe if you want the headers to be blue or something, that would be okay, the section headers. But don't start fooling around with all kinds of colors in a resume. It'll just be confusing and potentially turn off an employer. Don't put narrative text at the top. And what I mean by that is aggressive and professional graduate student with excellent writing and speaking abilities, seeks certain kind of job, for post-graduation of June 2024 or May 2024. You don't need that at the top of the resume. That kind of text belongs in a cover letter, although a lot better written than I just mentioned it. Start your resume out at the top with your name, your contact information, and below that, it depends. And we're going to talk about what should come next after that. So let's see. Will a copy of the slide deck be provided? If you send me an email, and I'll give you my email at the end of the address, I'll send you a PDF of it, okay? But I'll give you, actually, you know what? I'll type my address into the chat right now. That is my email address I'm talking about. And there it is in the chat, okay? Let's keep going. So first of all, before you start writing your resume, or before you start rewriting it, because I'm sure just about all of you have resumes, closely review your skill set. What elements of your existing skill set are relevant to the prospective career path you want to be on? Possibly you've been doing things that are only indirectly relevant, or maybe irrelevant to some degree, to the way in which you want to head with your career. So think about things like all those bullet points that I've got listed there. I'm not going to read every one of them, but research and analytics, quantitative skills, and that means not just statistics, but data analytics in particular, writing and editing abilities, foreign languages, and that means, generally speaking, a foreign language in which you could do a business meeting in that language. Because if you're not highly skilled at a language, then an employer can't trust you to work in that language. So if you've got 3 years of high school Spanish, which is generally not worth very much unless you were somebody for whom Spanish was spoken at home, don't list intermediate Spanish or basic Spanish. The employer doesn't care. They're not going to hire you for basic Spanish. What kind of software skills do you have? Aside from Microsoft Word and PowerPoint, yes, you can list those, but in particular, there's a lot of other software out there that you may have skills in that should be listed. Do you have any kind of management or coordinating skills, especially project planning type of skills? Have you had any experience abroad, studying or working, or both? Do you have region-specific expertise? And by that I mean regional worldwide or regional within the United States. Budget planning and tracking experience for most of you could be fairly important, even if you don't want a career where you're handling budgets, okay? But having an understanding of budgets, how they're planned, how they're monitored, and how they're evaluated once you're done with it is something most employers will value. And relevant volunteer experience, that's going to be in the section that we would call campus and community service, okay? I don't see any other questions, so let's keep going. How are grad student resumes different? Well, they could be up to 2 pages long, depending upon what you've got to put on that resume. However, there are resumes that go to certain types of employers that, generally speaking, should never go above 1 page. It's almost a religion with those employers. For example, management consulting firms, they only want to see 1-page resumes. And there are other kinds of employers, for a lot of particularly business-focused employers, for whom 1-page resumes are a must. And it's a tough decision to have to cut some of your content. But what I would suggest for those of you needing to do that is that you maintain a 1-page resume, and maybe maintain a resume that is longer than 1 page, but never longer than 2 pages. And you might also include something called a relevant coursework section if you don't have much internship or job experience. What is that going to cover courses that you've taken. If you are halfway through a master's program, for example, well, then you've got a bunch of graduate courses that you may be able to list. Not all of them, but some of them that are relevant to the job, or in some cases, the internship that you're applying for, okay? You should always include any special skills you have, whether it's data science, foreign languages, other kinds of software, etc. And because you never know if an employer might be interested in something, even if it's not on the job description, okay? Someone asks for IT and software industry, it is usually 1 or 2 pages. Yeah, my guess would be if you asked people at the Kogod Business School here at AU, they would tell you it should be 1 page for jobs in IT. On the other hand, if you've got a lot of IT skills you need to list, because it's important that those employers know a lot of all your IT skills, possibly you're going to go over a page. So let's keep going. Where should your education section go? Should it go at the top or the bottom? To a large degree, that depends on how much work experience you have. If you've got 5 relevant internships and or jobs on your resume, it's quite possible that you don't need to have your graduate education at the top. On the other hand, let's say you are an MS data science student and you're applying for jobs in data science. Well, you probably ought to have that MS in data science at the top of the resume, which means that your undergraduate degree is also going to be there, and any relevant certifications that you've got. When we're talking about an upcoming degree, if you're a senior, this applies to your bachelor's degree that presumably you're going to be receiving either in December or in May. You need to say something like American University, Washington, D.C. Next line, Master of Science, Data Science, just to give you one example, or Master of Public Policy. And then all the way on the right side, underneath where it says Washington, D.C., you should say expected graduation, whenever that is, December, May. If you're graduating in December, considering that we're almost into November, you probably don't need to say expected graduation anymore. But if you're graduating in May or August of next year, you should say expected graduation, so they realize you're not claiming to have graduated already. If you're going to have a relevant coursework section, then your education section must be at the top. Why? Because relevant coursework follows on directly underneath the education section. Okay, it's kind of obvious. Now, what would be? Let me go into a little bit more better explanation about relevant coursework. Typically, we're talking about 3 to 5 bullet points, meaning 3 to 5 courses. Never, ever, ever, ever use course numbers. They don't mean anything to anybody outside the university, and probably not even outside that professor's department. So just the title of the course. Let me give you one other piece of advice about that. If you want to list that you've taken what would you call it? Research methodology course, and the title of the course was Introduction to Research Methodology, I would take the introduction word off. And the reason is you're not trying to claim something you don't have, but a lot of employers I know, when they see the word introduction to in front of a relevant course, they will skip right over it because they'll think, oh, well, that was just an introductory course. When in fact, as we know, a lot of introductory courses, especially in grad school, can be quite demanding and quite useful in terms of your career path. So you might want to take that word introduction off the title if you are using a course like that as part of your relevant coursework. And by the way, you can combine in the relevant coursework section a course that you took as well as potentially a research paper that you wrote. But don't go into a 3 or 4 line explanation of the research paper, which I have seen people do. Nobody wants to read it. It's too detailed. We're talking about 1-line course titles and 1-line descriptions of specific important research that you've done if you're going to list that. And that's why I would call it relevant course work as opposed to relevant courses. That gives you the option potentially to list some research that you've done in there if it's relevant. Okay. If you are working on or have already a relevant certificate, for example, I know that in School of Public Affairs, a number of people are getting an additional graduate certificate in cybersecurity. And it's proving to be, from what I understand from the students, quite useful in terms of improving their appeal as a job candidate. So you would want to say graduate certificate, whatever the subject is, and the date that you received the certificate. Okay, date meaning month and year. Don't go into specific days of the year. Most of you will have a concentration in your graduate degree. Okay, don't list that concentration unless it's relevant to the job for which you are applying. I mean, I've seen people list concentrations, and I'm trying to think of one. Somebody getting a Master of Public Policy degree, and they list their concentration as something involving criminal justice, but they're not applying for jobs, or not all the jobs they're applying for involve criminal justice. Well, then don't list that concentration, because it tends to give an impression that you studied something else that wasn't relevant to that employer. Okay, only list a degree concentration if it's relevant to what you're applying for. Okay, and by the way, high school is ancient history, and that goes for seniors too who are listening this evening. No high school in your resume. Forget about it. Okay, and no GPAs of high school and coursework that you took in high school, or you were captain of the varsity swimming team in high school or whatever. No, high school's gone. All right. Relevant coursework. I've already talked about this a little bit, but let's keep going. It might be useful even if you have a lot of experience, especially if the field that you're trying to go into isn't completely aligned with your internship and job experience. But presumably your relevant coursework is more relevant to where you want to be going career-wise. As I said, no course numbers, one-line course titles or descriptions. I said 3 to 5 courses if you really need to. If you don't have a lot of experience in terms of internships and jobs, maybe list as many as 7 courses. Change the relevant courses list depending on the job. Oh yeah, that second last bullet point. For a second there, I didn't know what I meant. That means whatever is relevant will depend upon what you're applying for. So both the kinds of courses that are listed as well as the order that they are in will change from job to job if the jobs are somewhat different. Okay, and bullet point it again. We're talking about round black bullet points. Okay. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to keep going here. The skills profile. Okay, this is designed to be a 2-column, bullet-pointed, at a glance, highlighting of your skills and experience. So in other words, it's going to say things like advanced Excel user, other software skills, whatever. You're not going to say other software skills. You're going to say whatever those skills are. Advanced written and spoken French. And things like strong research and analytical skills, excellent written and oral communication. So it doesn't have to be totally specific to a language or a software. It could be a little more generic, but let me tell you something. There was a survey done by the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is the flagship publication of higher education in the United States. This was several years ago. They surveyed about 4,000 employers across the United States. And they asked, what are the most important things you're looking at in recent college graduates? Mainly, they were talking about people graduating with bachelor's degrees. But this also goes for people with master's degrees, especially if you didn't have a lot of time of working between your undergraduate and graduate degree. The 4 things that employers listed that were most important were research skills, analytical skills, writing skills, and oral communication, okay? And that doesn't mean giving speeches, because they're not going to hire you at the ages that most of you are at to make speeches. Oral communication means if I'm your boss and I was in management for a long time, and I had a young staffer and I assigned them to do a piece of research for me, and they came back and then they briefed me, and maybe they briefed a team of people that I put together. That's a briefing. That's not a speech. Okay. Don't list public speaking as a skill. It's not going to help you. I mean, maybe I'm not thinking about it. There may be some job where they want you to be a public speaker, but 99% of the time, that's not going to happen, again, with the experience level and the age that the vast bulk of you are at. So we're talking about written communication, oral communication, research skills, writing skills, research skills, and analytical skills. And preferably keep these are going to be little bullet points, because it's going to be half a page each. We divided it into 2 columns in a Word doc or a Google Doc. It's easy to do. If you don't know how to do it, ask a friend. And the idea behind having that, by the way, I've been advising graduate students, most graduate students, not necessarily everybody, to use a professional skills profile at the very top of your resume, right below their name and contact information. I've been advising them to do that for about 10 years. When I first read about the concept from, frankly, another career advisor who had a blog, somewhere else around the US. And overwhelmingly, I've gotten very positive feedback from the students that I urged to do that, in terms of how well they did and how employers would remark upon the skills profile being interesting. Why? Because it's a highlighting of your most relevant skills and experience and abilities. And the idea is that an employer looks at that for no more than 15 to 20 seconds and presumably, hopefully, thinks to themselves, oh, this person has this and this and this and this. Let's put them aside, meaning that you've gone pretty quickly, potentially, into a smaller group of candidates being considered, and possibly right into the group of people who are going to be interviewed, okay? It encourages the employer to read the rest of your resume at the very least, as I say there. And not much else to mention about that, and I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to keep going. This is kind of what it looks like, okay? I didn't fill out the whole resume, but this is so we've got your name at the top, your street address, your email and telephone number. And by the way, if you are applying for a job in the DC area, in DC, Maryland, or Virginia, you desperately need a DC, Maryland, or Virginia address at the top of your resume. If you don't want to list your private address to protect your privacy, then list a use address: 4400 Massachusetts Avenue, Washington, DC. 4400 Massachusetts Avenue. Why? Because a lot of people want to work in DC and they don't live in DC, and they're listing addresses from all over the country. And for entry-level jobs, or jobs that are a bit above entry level that a lot of grad students will be going for, that still aren't senior positions, employers don't want to hassle with bringing in people from other parts of the country. There are plenty of qualified graduates in this, and upcoming graduates in this area. And so they'd much rather bring you in. I mean, I can tell you, as someone who was a senior manager for a long time, and mostly this was in Europe, and so I was hiring people from all over the world. If I hired someone locally, which unfortunately didn't happen that often, but if I did, their mind was not in a blur when they started the job. In other words, they were used to the city that we were in, which in that case was Geneva, Switzerland. When people are new to a city, even if it's within the same country that you've been living in, it's kind of a blur. You're getting used to transportation, to new housing, to whole new circumstances. You've uprooted yourself away from a lot of friends and family, potentially. And from an employer's point of view, that's distracting. And that's why they'd rather have people who are local, okay? So use a DC address. Now, if you are an online student listening to this presentation, and you're not in DC, but you want to be in DC, I would list 4400 Massachusetts Avenue, Washington, DC. And then if you get into a Zoom interview or Microsoft Teams or whatever, And they say, well, by the way, where are you? Because we noticed that you've got this job in Seattle, but you're doing this graduate program at American University. So then you explain, well, I'm about to finish an online graduate program at American University, and I'm about to move to DC. That's your explanation. You want to get over that hurdle of an employer's fairly low-level resume reviewer being told, oh, if it's not DC, just toss it. If it's not the DC area, that is. So they don't see District, Maryland, Virginia, and they don't even look at the rest of the resume a lot of the time. I can't tell you how many recent graduates I've spoken with 3 months, 6 months after graduation, telling me they've applied for 50 jobs and haven't gotten an interview or got very few, and they're frustrated. And then I look at their resume and they, to pay the bills or to be able to just live because they couldn't pay the bills, they moved back with their parents in Illinois and they're listing that Illinois address. And it's just a killer for getting jobs in DC. So you've got to list a DC address, whether it's friends, family, or the always useful 4400 Massachusetts Avenue. All right. And by the way, if you're applying for a job in another city, you want to, if at all possible, be using an address in that city, particularly if you got friends or family in whatever it is, New York, Boston, Los Angeles, Chicago, etc. Because the same rules apply, particularly in big cities that have universities around there and they have a lot of job candidates who are qualified. Okay. Now, take a look at the professional skills profile. That this actually was a real person a long time ago, probably about 8 years ago. And notice how, we've got neat 2 columns. There are 5 bullet points on one side and 4 on the other side because one of the bullet points goes over a line. And this person highlighted her various skills that were relevant to a particular job. Were she, and she was a she, were she to apply to a different job, she might rearrange those bullet points or take some things out and put something else in that isn't in that profile list. But this is the way a professional skills profile needs to look. Combination of experience and skills, basically, that highlight your what is most relevant that employer, that you want that employer to look at, okay? And then below that, you're either going to have, well, if you have education, you may want to have relevant coursework. Honors, well, that depends. If you made the dean's list as an undergrad, that's listed in education, okay, along with your GPA. There's no such thing as a dean's list in grad school, so don't worry about that. Most academic honors should be listed with in an education section and not in a separate section. Then we get down to professional experience, and notice the 2 headers that I put in there. One is called relevant professional experience, excuse me. The other is called additional work experience. So if you, worked at Starbucks and at another point you worked at a movie theater or something, selling popcorn, whatever, that's not relevant professional experience. At least I'm pretty sure it's not for the vast bulk of you. And so if your most recent job is working at Starbucks, you don't want that at the top of your experience section. That's the last thing you want them to see. So you put that under additional work experience. If you need to list it at all, by the way, you might not really even need to. And you just have a section called relevant professional experience, which might only be 2 out of 5 jobs and internships you've had, or maybe 3. And you list those in reverse chronology, but those are the relevant ones, okay? So very important to be doing it that way. And then notice at the very bottom, I've got community and campus service, or campus and community service. You could call it activities or not activities. That phrase, campus and community service, pushes the right buttons with employers much better than leadership or what else do people say? Volunteer. The word volunteer is an invitation to an employer. This isn't important. Don't read it. Okay. And leadership is a word, quite honestly, for Americans, left over from high school, where they told everybody that you all ought to be leaders, which, when you think about it, is not a great idea. But anyway, I noticed there's some questions, so let me get to the question. I'm a grad student with expensive core work experience, taking a hiatus from work, going to grad school full time, then looking for consulting. I'll be doing an internship in an interim period. Suggestions on how to list being a full-time grad student doing pro bono internship work while in grad school. Yeah, under experience, you list the internship experience that you're doing. But for grad school, all you really should be listing, and the same thing for undergrad, is the date that you graduated or the date you expect to graduate. Okay. Employers largely don't care when you went to grad school, how many years, and same thing for undergrad. They care when you graduated. Okay. So if you're, in the case of this person, if you're doing some kind of internship work, then just list that as under your experience. Whenever it started to the present, if you're still doing it, for example. I hope that answers your question. If not, follow up. So I'm going to leave this slide and go on to why you should reject the tyranny of reverse chronology. Pretty much I've already explained that. If you look down to the third bullet point, keep any retail work you've done or nannying or dog walking. And I understand you did that to pay the bills, okay? When I was in college, my father got me a couple jobs in factories that were fairly well paying, but boy, were they miserable. But I did it. And by the way, with regard to these retail nannying, dog walking type things, just keep it to the name of the employer, whatever your title was. And if you didn't have a title, if it was childcare, you don't want to call yourself a nanny, probably childcare, something like that. And then the dates you did it. And if it says childcare, you probably don't need to explain it any better than that, unless you really feel like it, or unless you were taking care of 10 kids or something extraordinary. Okay. And with retail, don't go into 3 bullet points of explanation about everything you did and how you dealt with the cash register and other stuff. Just something like, provided excellent customer service at a busy retail outlet. Something like that is probably good enough. Okay. And as I say there, actually, I didn't even look at the last bullet point, but that's pretty much what I would suggest that you say. Okay. So that's that in terms of getting past the reverse chronology problem by dividing it up into relevant experience and additional experience. Leadership. Again, as I said, I got ahead of myself there. It's left over from high school. I would think twice. I would think 3 times about listing my hobbies. Employers largely don't care unless there's some relevance to the job you're applying to. Okay. Or unless, you're a mountain climber and you climbed Everest, which I think an employer would find impressive. I mean, something like that. Call it community service if it fits. All right. And it all goes down at the bottom of the resume. Okay. And don't necessarily expect that they're going to read it, that an employer is going to read that section. Now, applicant tracking systems. What is an applicant tracking system? Again, I sort of explained it at the beginning. You see a job posting. Generally, internships don't go into applicant tracking systems. And with internships, you're pretty much just sending them an email with an attachment. Okay. With an applicant tracking system, you see a job posting and it says, click here to apply. You click and you find yourself inside the employer's applicant tracking system, although it probably is not called that. Well, I don't know what they will call it, their database or whatever. And you will be asked, well, first of all, you'll probably have to put in your contact information separately, even though it's in the resume. And you may well be confronted by a series of questions. These are known as filtering questions. And what are they? They're designed to filter out 80 to 90% of the people who enter the applicant tracking system. And they'll ask things like, do you have 2 years experience doing X? And yes or no. And if you answer no, it probably will kick you right out of the system and say, yeah, we appreciate your interest, and please think of us in the future when you are applying for a job, something like that. Those filtering questions can be pretty hard-nosed. Typically, there's only 3 or 4 or 5 of them. But if you get past now, if it's a close call when you're answering those questions, give yourself the benefit of the doubt, of course. But then you get into the place where they say, please upload your resume. They may or may not ask you to upload a cover letter. A lot of employers don't care about cover letters. But understand that the logarithms and basically it's artificial intelligence that's going to scan and evaluate your resume mostly won't do it for a cover letter. They're only going to do it for a resume. So you pretty much live and die with your resume, whether it's an applicant tracking system employer or what I would call an email employer. 90% of the time, you're going to get an interview or not get an interview based upon your resume only. So how can you tell how to make yourself look more appealing to the algorithms in those applicant tracking systems? Those systems have been told by somebody in HR for a specific job to look for certain words and phrases for a particular job, okay? And usually those words and phrases are going to be found, in fact, almost always, in the mandatory or preferred qualifications section of a job posting. So you look there, and what are those mandatory or preferred qualifications going to be? It's going to be certain kinds of software, certain types of experience, research analytical skills, multitasking, etc. And usually the way these systems work is on a 5-star basis, 5 stars being the highest score you're going to get. And because these evaluation systems can be pretty tough, they're meant to save human beings from having to go through a lot of resumes. That's why they work the way they do. Generally speaking, only people with 4-star and 5-star resumes are going to actually be asked to do interviews. But how can you influence the algorithms? You go through the job description and you try to pick out the keywords and phrases, mostly from the mandatory and preferred qualification sections of the job description. Try to pick out the words and phrases that you believe that means human resources department, is telling the applicant tracking system to look for candidates for that job. And then what you do is, if you have some or most or all of those qualifications, before you upload your resume, you pump it up fairly shamelessly with those words and phrases in a way that's going to raise your score. So if they're looking for somebody with advanced Excel skills, and by the way, that means that you know how to manipulate data in Excel using filters and pivot tables in Excel. That's kind of the formal, informal definition of somebody with advanced Excel skills. If you've got advanced Excel skills and they're looking for someone with advanced Excel skills, you might want to, if possible, if this is true, for 4 different jobs and internship you've got, have a bullet point that said position required daily use of advanced Excel skills. Position required daily use of advanced Excel skills. Every time you use that phrase, your score is going up because the algorithms are reacting to it, okay? What is your objective? It's to be among what is typically 12 to 15 to 20 candidates whose resumes are going to be picked up by the algorithms, listed as the top candidates, and then printed out, and then 1 or 2 people or 3 people, actually human beings, are actually deciding who among these 12 or 15 people are we going to interview, because typically, unless they're hiring multiple vacancies for the same job, if it's only 1 vacancy, typically they're only going to be interviewing maximum 5 candidates. They might do phone interviews with 7 or 8 people for 15 minutes each, and then knock that down to maybe 4 candidates who then get real interviews, usually these days on Zoom or Microsoft Teams, not in person. I was talking to a person just this afternoon who actually is going in for an in-person interview. One of the few people I've spoken with in months who's having an in-person interview for a job. Typically, employers like the convenience of just having to turn on their screen on their computer and do the interview that way. This is sort of a depiction of an applicant tracking system, okay? Lots of candidates go in, and then they get filtered, and then maybe 3 or 4 come out at the other end, and those are the people who are interviewed. Now, do we have any other questions? Yes, we do. I'm working with AU's VMOC resource and the AU Career Center Engagement Office regarding my resume. After I update based on the data shared today, would I continue to work with them, or should I be accessing another resource? I suggest you have it reviewed by a career advisor. And I don't know what school you're in the main AU Career Center, which covers School of Public Affairs, School of Communication, College of Arts and Sciences. Yeah, that's that. And the forgot what it's called. It used to be called Specs. I can't think of what the program is called now. Anyway, if your career advisor is in the main career center, there is no career advisor with less than about 12 or 15 years experience there, and you should actually have a real person, a real experienced career advisor to whom you explain the purpose of the resume, i.e. what it is you're applying for, what your career path is, and then they look at the resume and then you discuss it. Okay, that's my suggestion, aside from all the other resources that you've talked about there. Okay. I have no idea what MSSM is. You're going to have to explain that to me. Sustainability management. Okay. Thank you. I presume that's in COGAD. And if it is, they've got an excellent career center, and they're experienced career advisors there, and I would have one of them look at it. Okay. So, yeah, that's that. I don't see anybody else at the moment. Be ready to justify everything on your resume. And here's someone whom you may know, who wildly exaggerated. And now he's showing up in federal court on a lot of indictments, not because of his resume, but because of a lot of corruption. Anyway, if you're tempted to exaggerate, and I know, no, not any of you are, but if you're tempted to exaggerate, remember the trouble that can get you into. So if you've only got intermediate, whatever language it is, and the job specifies that they want somebody who can do business meetings in that language, they may well, in the middle of the interview, bring somebody in who is a native speaker or highly, highly fluent. And the next thing you know, they're testing out your French or your Portuguese or your Arabic or whatever it is. Okay, that happens a lot. When I interviewed for the United Nations when I was in Geneva, and I was interviewed by a guy whom I found out later hated Americans, and he wasn't an American, and he thought, Americans, they don't speak any language. Actually, I had been in Geneva for about 8 years at that time, and I spoke really good French, and my French was better than his. So he starts out the interview in French, and I thought, well, okay, if this is the way it's going to be, and he actually was honest enough to let me continue on, and I got the job and worked with the UN for a while. But those kind of things can happen sometimes in the middle of the interview when that's been in English and then shifted over, and that's just sort of a worst case scenario of being blindsided with something if you've exaggerated, for example, a language ability. If you're a data science student Don't exaggerate your your various abilities in various aspects of data science, because you might well be talking to somebody who knows it really well, and they'll say to you, well, tell me about a specific kind of project that you've done using X, whatever it is. Okay. In fact, I have talked to data science students, and that's among the most common questions they get asked. Yeah, tell me about a project that you did either in an internship or a job or a classroom using this kind of software. Okay, using Python or using RStudio or something like that. Okay, tell me about a data visualization project you did in using RStudio. Okay, or R. You've got to be ready for that stuff, and part of that means don't exaggerate. Because there's another technique, by the way, that you should know about. It's called behavioral interviewing. It's a way of interviewing someone for which, if the interviewer is skilled, they will catch you out exaggerating. They will ask you a specific question, and then they'll ask you more and more and more questions about it. And if your story is made up, eventually you'll probably, unless you're a psychopath, you'll probably contradict yourself at one point, and then they kind of got you. I was interviewing for a very senior position with a think tank in DC when I returned from Europe, and I found out that the person I was up against, they caught him out in terms of some exaggerating as a result of very intensive behavioral interviewing. And when he realized he'd been caught out, he kind of leaped up after 2 hours of being interviewed and said, I withdraw my candidacy, and grabbed his papers and literally almost ran out of the room to the elevators. Anyway, don't exaggerate. Okay. I think that, be prepared to justify everything on your resume, and be prepared for weird questions. I mean, I was just telling someone this afternoon, and this doesn't necessarily mean they're trying to catch you out, but somebody sees the third most recent job or interview or internship you've done, and they pick the third bullet point and they say, yeah, tell me more about that project you worked on. And you're thinking to yourself, that project has no relevance to this job. Why are they asking me this? But you just have to play along. Okay. So you gotta be quick on your feet for this stuff. And that actually was the last slide. So I'm gonna go back. Oops, I really didn't want to do that. Let me go back to a full screen. We don't have to look at George Santos's resume there. I'll just leave you with Applicant Tracking Systems. Now, do we have other questions? I've lost the Q&A. Where did it go? It's not there. Hang on a second while I find the Q&A. I'm going to have to get rid of this and find the Q&A. Sorry, it says there's 11 questions there, and all I have is the chat, which nobody is using, apparently. So let me get rid of that and try to find the Q&A. This is ridiculous. Sorry, now you're looking at my family there. Why can't I find the Q&A? Tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to probably close the Q&A, maybe. I can't find the darn Q&A. This is really frustrating. So I'm just going to start closing things until I get to a point where, this is for a presentation I'm giving next week, and the Q&A has just gone and disappeared. Let me stop the recording, because this is kind of embarrassing.